Is Jesus' resurrection just a later legend invented by the gospel writers many years after his death? Some 30 to 60 years after his death when they first put pen to papyrus? That's a great question that somebody asked. And I took time last week in last week's blog to go in depth into the way they framed it, because the way they posed that question was so compelling. What's also great about that question is it happens to be the best explanation that people who don't believe Jesus really resurrected offer for explaining why the church eventually came to believe in his resurrection. It happens to be, among the experts, the scholars who study the resurrection, the most popular alternative explanation for the resurrection. The whole thing hinges on what those first disciples believed they saw when they claimed Jesus appeared to them. Did they believe that he was just appearing as a spirit, as something that was immaterial? Or did they believe that he was appearing physically, bodily, raised from the dead? If they believed that he was appearing bodily, physically, then the resurrection can't be a later legend. It was something that they were claiming right from the start. The key to figuring all this out is to look at what Paul says, what he writes, because what he writes are the earliest texts we have in the New Testament, and they're the only ones really that are written around the time that these earliest disciples would have still been alive. He knew many of these earliest disciples, and he knew what they were claiming about the resurrection, and moreover, Paul himself claims to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. So Paul is the key to understanding what those early disciples were claiming about Jesus, how they understood his appearances to them. For decades, scholars have argued and debated over a passage in 1 Corinthians 15 that is the focus of their efforts to try to figure out what Paul thought about the resurrected body. And in particular, they argue over a term, an unusual term Paul uses, where he talks about the resurrected body being a spiritual body. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is talking about what the believer's body will be like in resurrection. And the term he uses to describe that is a spiritual body. He bases all that on what he believes Jesus looked like when he appeared to him, and what he heard the other disciples claiming about the nature of Jesus' appearance to them. So the whole key to understanding what the earliest disciples were saying about Jesus' resurrected appearance, how he appeared when he came back from the dead, and as they claimed he did. The whole key to that is understanding what Paul is saying here in this passage, according to scholars over the years, what that term spiritual body means. But while this term has been debated throughout the decades, over the past decade or so, more and more scholars are coming to the conclusion that the spiritual body Paul is talking about is an actual body, that it's a physical body. In other words, that he believed that when believers died, that their mortal body, the body that they lived in on earth, what he calls the natural body, will be transformed into a spiritual body in resurrection. And of course, he's basing that on the pattern and the assurance he has in what he saw in Jesus when Jesus appeared to him. So it seems like Paul is saying that Jesus was resurrected bodily, using this term spiritual body, was resurrected bodily. Even the most prominent skeptical scholar of our day, Bart Ehrman, agrees with that. He's concluded that Paul, there's no doubt, that Paul believed that Jesus had appeared to him in an actual body, the same body that he lived in, his mortal body, albeit transformed and glorified, but that Jesus was bodily resurrected. That's what Ehrman concludes. But whatever ambiguity there is in this term spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15, there are a couple other passages where Paul talks about the resurrected body that eliminate all that ambiguity, that make it very clear what he thought about the resurrected body. Perhaps the clearest place is in Romans 8, verse 11. Listen to what he says here. He says, "If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also." That's the key. To your mortal bodies also, through his spirit that dwells in you. Clearly what Paul is envisioning here is that the mortal body we dwell in now will somehow be transformed in resurrection by the Spirit. It couldn't be any clearer that Paul, in this passage, that what Paul believes happens in resurrection is that our mortal bodies are transformed, that we actually have a body in resurrection, a transformed and glorified body, but an actual body. And that means that Paul believed when Jesus appeared to him and what he heard the other disciples claiming, that Jesus was resurrected bodily. If his understanding of what our resurrected bodies will look like is based on what Jesus' resurrected body looked like, then there's no doubt that Paul thought Jesus was bodily, physically resurrected from the dead. And that means that the resurrection can't be a later legend. Well, as if this isn't enough, there's actually other reasons to believe that the resurrection isn't a later legend. And in next week's blog, I'll talk about another one of these reasons, which is even if those first disciples weren't claiming that Jesus had been resurrected bodily, even if we didn't have any evidence of that, there is no way that those later gospel writers, 30 to 60 years later, would have invented the idea. There's every reason to believe that they would never talk about Jesus being resurrected bodily from the dead. In fact, they had every reason not to talk about him being resurrected. They have every reason to talk about him instead coming back from the dead spiritually in the form of a pure spirit. And I'll explain more about that in next week's blog. So do you think this passage from Paul from Romans 8:11 clears up the ambiguity about what Paul thought and therefore about what the early church, the earliest disciples were claiming about Jesus, about him being bodily resurrected? I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can go to the Contact DJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave them there. I look forward to hearing from you.